Hi, folks, and welcome to this lecture on religious options and expressions in the Roman Empire. Now, when I say religious options in the Roman Empire, I mean, of course, other than Judaism and Christianity. Since this is a course on the historical and political and social context of Christianity in the Roman Empire, I'm going to assume you know enough about Judaism that we don't need to touch on that. But this lecture is about all of the other religious options available and what Roman religion was like and kind of the religious and cultural context in which the early church found itself. Now, remember the way we use the word pagan. It's a bit anachronistic for the early centuries of Christianity, but if you remember your intro course, the word pagan comes from the Latin pagani, meaning the country dwellers, the people who live out in the sticks. And by the 4th century or so, there was a sense, or at least a stereotype, that the only people who still believed in the old Greco-Roman religions were those people who lived out in the country. Now, that's not really accurate, but nevertheless, this word pagani, or pagan, as we say in English, comes to mean those people who believe in the religions other than Judaism and Christianity. So when we use the word pagan, we're not making a judgment. We're just using it as a descriptor for people who aren't Jews or Christians. Okay, so this is really about what pagan religion looks like in the Roman Empire during the time of the early church. Now, the first thing you have to remember is that Roman religion is non-exclusive. That is, you can worship as many gods as you want. In fact, the more, the better. You're hedging your bets by worshiping more of them. Now, of course, you probably already know this, but in that kind of a system, the different gods have different spheres of influence. We might say different functions. So you have a god of war and a god of love, and these are not the same deities. Now, in the Roman mind, they stay out of each other's way so that they're not in competition with each other. In other words, that giving them different jobs to do makes them not compete with each other. But the church fathers, especially Tertullian, would point out that, if they all have different spheres of influence and they all have different functions and they have to stay out of each other's way and not step on each other's toes, well, that means that none of them, not even the high God, can be omnipotent or omnipresent, right? No single deity can be everything or all in all the way the Judeo-Christian God is. And so that was a way of pointing out that this system of multiple deities ultimately breaks down, because the minute you assume multiple deities, then you are admitting that none of them are all-powerful. Okay, the other thing is that Roman religion is non-moral, or we might say amoral, in the sense that there is not really a morality built into it. There's no such thing as holiness in Greco-Roman religion, because the gods don't really care how you treat other people. They only care whether you're loyal to them. And so in Roman thought, piety is not so much holiness, but it's more about loyalty to the deity in question and faithfulness in terms of ritual participation. So, in a Christian context, you could have a person who goes to church every week, but their heart isn't in it. Well, that wouldn't matter in a Roman context. As long as the person participates in the regular rituals, they are considered pious, whether or not they actually believe anything. And as we'll see, personal belief is not necessarily actually required. The other thing is that you have to keep in mind is that there's a difference between morality and ethics. And so when I say that Greco-Roman religion doesn't really have a morality, they do have ethics, but ethics are not the same as morality. Ethics is more the realm of philosophy, and I'll have a few things to say about that later, but ethics tends to be utilitarian, right? So if you were to boil Plato's ethics, down to one idea, it would be sort of the opposite of the golden rule, right? Instead of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, it's don't do unto others what you don't want them to do to you. And so ethics says, I don't steal from you only because I don't want you to turn around and steal from me. And so it's sort of a social contract. Hey, let's all not steal from each other. But it doesn't really have a morality as its foundation, in the sense that that somehow there's something inherently wrong with stealing. It's just inconvenient for us. I know I'm oversimplifying that, but you get the idea. Ethics and morality are not the same thing. The Greco-Roman religions have an ethics, but they don't, at least not at the beginning, have a morality. The priests of the Roman religions are not spiritual advisors. They're not moral guides through this life, right? And serving a Greco-Roman god does not require any moral standards beyond social conventions and avoiding embarrassment. And so things like being dishonored are really, the kinds of sins that someone in the Greco-Roman world would think about. For example, if you did something that dishonored yourself or your family, the appropriate response to that might be suicide in a Greco-Roman culture. Well, obviously that's different from Christian morality. Roman religion is really about a service blessing relationship. The person serves the deity blesses the person. The person serves the deity protects the person. It is a bargaining kind of contract. And in Greco-Roman religion, prayer is a form of bargaining. Now, I know that it works out, it feels that way sometimes in Judeo-Christian religion too, but it's not supposed to be, really. Because in pagan religion, prayer is a form of bargaining in which usually there is a precise wording to the bargaining that's necessary, right? And there's a legalism to the words of the prayers and the ritual, and to the offerings that are presented as like payments in this bargaining relationship. Now, you may remember in Matthew, I think it's Matthew 6-7, Jesus criticized people who go on, and he says, they think that they will be heard for their many words. And this is that passage that often gets very poorly translated as having something to do with vain repetition. But the words vain and repetition are not in the Greek at all. It's not about vain repetition. What Jesus is criticizing is people who go on as if their own words are what's important. And there's really two different criticisms here in one. Jesus is criticizing two kinds of babbling on and on. The one kind of babbling on and on is to impress the gods, and the other kind is to impress other people. So the first kind of babbling on and on that Jesus is criticizing is this sort of pagan prayer in which you have to cajole the gods with just the right words in order to get them to do what you want. And the gods feel no compassion for you or love for you. The gods would really rather not do what you want or even what you need, but you sort of manipulate them into having to do it if you use exactly the right words. So that's the first kind, the going on and on to impress the gods. The other kind that Jesus is criticizing there is going on and on to impress other people. In other words, speaking to be perceived as eloquent by the other people who are hearing the prayer. So that's the other kind. So in one critique there, Jesus is criticizing both of those kinds of babbling on and on, but it's the first one that's relevant here. It's that, that pagan prayer is all about saying just the right words in just the right way to sort of force the gods to do what you want. Now, you can see in this, in the way I'm describing the service protection or service blessing relationship here, you can see that Roman religion is really, it's either an extension of the patron-client system or it's the foundation of it. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, so I can't tell you for sure which comes first. But let's call it an extension of the patron-client system, right? And if you remember the patron-client system, this is a network of social relationships in which the more powerful person is supposed to provide for and protect the less powerful person. The less powerful person is supposed to serve the more powerful person. Well, in Greco-Roman religion, the deity is the patron and the worshiper is the client. And so it's just an extension of that same social network all the way up into the realm of the divine. And so to serve a deity, to worship a deity, is all about public ritual. And you'll notice, if you look at pagan temples, the altar is on the outside of the temple, not on the inside, right? Because Greco-Roman religion is not an internal religion. It's not a religion of the heart. It's an external religion. It's a religion that you do to demonstrate your loyalty to the deities whom you hope will protect you and bless you. But Greco-Roman religion, especially when we get into the Roman Empire, Roman religion is also their form of patriotism, right? And so it's something you do to demonstrate your loyalty to the empire and to the emperor. We'll have more to say about that in a bit. But the point is you keep this in mind. In all of human history, until the 4th century, there was never a separation of religion and government. Religion and government were always intimately intertwined, right? And even if you look at Judaism, look at the Old Testament, and see how Israel was not supposed to have a king initially because God is their king, but then they get kings. But even then, the king is not above the law, right? The king answers to God, right? And so human history has never had a situation where religion and government were separate until the Emperor Constantine invented the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, there's a myth out there that Constantine invented the marriage of church and state. It's just the opposite. He invented the idea of the separation of government and religion. He invented the idea of religious freedom, in which, to use the words of the Edict of Milan, paraphrasing a bit, but everyone should have the right to worship according to their own conscience, and yet not have that related to their patriotism or their citizenship. So keep that in mind. There's no such thing, initially in this context of a separation of church and state. Religion and government are one thing. And so to participate in Roman religion is to demonstrate yourself as a patriot, a good citizen, right? Okay, so I'm going to go through 6 layers of Greco-Roman religion. And again, I'll give you some of the Greek background, but mostly we're talking about religion in the Roman Empire. Religion in the Roman Empire exists in layers because as I said, the Roman religion is non-exclusive. You can worship as many gods as you want. So you have these layers of religion, and most people's religion existed in several, if not all, of the layers. Okay, so here we go. So the first layer is household religion. Now, household religion, this is the layer, I think, of all the layers. This is the layer that continues on the longest after the Roman Empire is converted and even after Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And this is the reason why, the people out in the countryside could be called, pagani in that pejorative sense, because they continued the traditions of their ancestors in their own household, even after the official culture had converted to Christianity. And this is kind of the exception of the rule to religion being very public or very civic. This is the more private aspect of it. It's still not internal. It's still not, like what you believe in your heart. It's still not about that. But it's private in the sense that it goes on in the home, where the head of a household, usually the father in a household, functions kind of like the priest of the household religion. And every household would have had an altar or a shrine dedicated to certain gods, but mostly specific gods in certain places in the home. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. But offerings were made on these altars, or offerings were left in these shrines. And the offering can be anything from flowers to food, and leaving this offering is a sign of devotion to the deity, and it's a sign of trust in the deity for the deity's protection or providence. So, in other words, and I mean, again, you will see as we go through this, you'll see parallels to Judeo-Christian religion too. Here's one of them. The idea that you might give up some of your food as an offering to a deity is a sign that you trust that deity to provide you with food tomorrow so you don't starve to death. So the offering is a sign of trust in that deity. So this is the kind of service that would be offered to household deities, offerings and prayers, especially at mealtime. All right. So if you were a Roman at this time in the Roman Empire, you might have an altar or a shrine at the door. This would be a shrine or altar to a god that protects you in your comings and goings as you go through the front door. This god watches over the household and supposedly protects it. Now, in Greek culture, this would be an altar to a god called Zeus Herkeios. This is the god of the enclosure, the god of the boundary, the god of the gateway. In Roman culture, it would probably be not so much an altar, but more of a niche shrine, or perhaps a kind of a cupboard with little doors, and probably to a god called Janus, Janus, or the English sometimes call it Janus. If you're a fan of the 007 movies, there was it GoldenEye? I can't remember. One of the 007 movies, the bad guy's name was Janus, but this is a reference to this god Janus, who is the god of the doorway, and this is the two-faced god, facing in and out at the same time, also facing toward the past and the future at the same time. So you get this image with the two faces facing in opposite directions, right? So you have that at the doorway. But most of the household gods in Roman culture were actually thought to be unknown. This was part of the mystery of it. You don't know who they are. They don't have names per se, but they're referred to as the Lares, these anonymous good spirits of the household. And the household shrine that's dedicated to the Lares is called the Lararium, right? And again, this is probably a niche. There might be a painting in it, or there might be a bronze statue. And for those of you who are reading A Week in the Life of Rome, there's some pictures of this. A bronze statue might be of an unnamed deity holding a little plate, and that you could put little bits of food on that plate as an offering. You would also have an altar or shrine to the god of the pantry. And this also could be a bronze statue. It could be a statue of a snake, the idea being that snakes keep rodents away, keep the rodents out of your pantry. But also the snake represents for the Romans the good spirit or the genius of the house. I'm going to say more about what a genius is later. It doesn't mean just a really smart person. The genius is the spirit of someone or something. And it's actually where our English word genie comes from. But at any rate, we'll get to that. But the snake, the little bronze snake, might represent the good spirit of the house in the pantry. For the Romans, the spirits of the pantry are also unknown and unnamed, but they're referred to collectively as the penates, right? And again, you could put out bits of food as offerings to the penates, the deities of the pantry. Then there might be a shrine for the goddess of the hearth, right? In Greek culture, Hestia, or in Roman culture, Vesta. You've heard of the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins were the priestesses of the cult of the goddess Vesta, who was the goddess of the hearth of all of Rome, right? But within the home, you also might have a shrine to the goddess of the hearth, or perhaps the hearth itself was considered the sort of altar to Vesta. And there too, you might offer bits of food, especially before a meal. After the meal, you might pour out what they call a libation offering, a drink offering, and pour out some wine on the hearth. And, that again is meant to be like a thanksgiving to the goddess Vesta, who provides food for your family. And so, like I said, within the household, the father of the house functions as the priest there, and there would be a whole calendar of special occasions, rites of passage within the family. Certain days of the month, you put flowers in the Lararium, and there are certain things that you have to do to be a pious family, a religiously observant family in the Roman culture, right? So just to kind of summarize that, in Roman culture, there's really sort of 4 kinds of household deities or protecting spirits. You've got Janus at the door, you've got Vesta at the hearth, and then you've got the anonymous or unnamed spirits of the Lares and the penates in the pantry. Okay, so that's household religion. Now, layer number 2. Layer number 2 is popular religion. Okay, so in popular religion, it is believed, it's assumed that these spirits, the genius of a thing, the spirit of a person or place, there are spirits that inhabit everything, right? So that very little in the universe is actually inanimate, right? Spirits inhabit mountains, forests, trees, stones, rivers, all of that. And so then what you have is there are deities that are sort of personified types or archetypes of these rivers, seas, oceans, winds. As time goes on, they might become more metaphorical, but in the rural areas, again, these beliefs continued longer, that there were actually spirits in these different elements of nature that had to be appeased if you wanted their blessing. So, for example, if you were going to travel through the forest and you wanted to make it through and have a good trip, you would want to appease the spirits of the forest, right? You get the idea. For the Romans, Silvanus was the god of farm and forest, right? And so these nature spirits kind of function like the Lares of the outdoors. You have the Lares for inside your house. Outside their house, there's also this, collection of spirits, some of them named, some of them unnamed. But you definitely want to appease these spirits, especially when you're traveling through their realm. And so to serve all these nature spirits usually meant putting up shrines in their realm, whatever that is. So you might put up a monument made of a pile of stones by the roadside, and you hope that that by doing that, you hope that they understand that you're doing that to honor them, and then they will then protect you, especially when you're outside or on the road. Travelers going by, if you were traveling and you saw that pile of stones, you knew exactly what that meant, and you would add a stone to pay your respects, or you would leave a food offering, right? And so So you have these outdoor spirits then as well, where you can see that this becomes a little bit more of a public expression of religion. Now, in some ways, the lowest classes of Roman culture, those who had nothing to lose from not being pious in the sense of showing themselves to be patriotic, if they didn't participate a lot in the civic cult, which we'll get to, then for them, the household religion and the popular religion are their main forms of expression of religion. But popular religion has three more important elements that exist throughout Roman culture that I want to touch on. Okay, so three important elements of popular religion. The first is oracles. Now, an oracle is kind of like a prophet. Oracles are supposedly able to answer questions, and the answer is the will of the deity, right? Now, this is not so much like a psychic where they're telling the future. It's more like, what does the deity want me to do in this situation? Is it better to do A or B? So if you went to an oracle, you would ask the question like that. Is it better to do this or that? Or what's the best way to get X, whatever it is you want, right? So again, not exactly telling the future, but more like what help, what advice can I get from the deities to get me what I want, right? And there were oracles in certain ancient cities, and people would make pilgrimages to these oracles. And to ask the oracle a question, you would have to make an offering. And basically what that means is you would have to buy a special cake from the oracle's assistant and make that offering to the oracle. And so the cake is very, very expensive. So basically you're paying for the oracle's advice, but you're doing it through this system of having to buy an offering cake. And then when you ask your question, you ask the assistant. The assistant asks the oracle, and the oracle comes up with an answer. Now, it's probably the case that you also, like when, if you made a pilgrimage to an oracle and you got to the city, the first thing you do is you'd have to put your name on a list and get in the queue, line up. And you probably had to ask your question ahead of time. And I'm guessing days in advance. You'd stay in that city a while until it was your turn. And then when it was your turn, you made your offering. The answer came back in rhyme. And so clearly the oracle knew the question ahead of time and had time to, come up with a rhyming answer that was just vague enough that they were basically telling you what you wanted to hear. But again, if you're reading A Week in the Life of Rome, the scene with the oracle that's pretty accurate. That's pretty much how it would be. All right, so oracles. The second element of popular religion is magic. Now, just like oracles, just like all of this really, but magic is really the attempt to control nature or the course of events in your life by the use of spells or rituals. Now, I know you probably didn't need that definition of magic from me, but the operative words here are the attempt to control, because the point is that the assumptions of Greco-Roman religion have a lot to do with fate. And fate, if it's taken as deterministic, is the opposite of hope, right? And so what people really want is they want to have some sort of control over their life to not be at the mercy of fate or the mercy of fickle gods or whatever. And for many people, this was their attempt at finding a source of hope in life. They wanted some control, and with magic, you did that using spells or amulets. There are four kinds of spells: love spells, protection spells, curses, and there are fortune-telling spells. But it's hard to it's hard to find those in the literature, and so it's unclear just how much that is like our tarot cards or psychics or anything like that now. But obviously, you know what a love spell does. It's meant to make somebody fall in love with you. Protection spells are meant to protect you from other people's curse spells, right? And so there are curses, curse spells, and a curse could be just an incantation, or the Romans had this thing called a curse tablet, which is usually a piece of lead, and there's an incantation inscribed on it, sometimes written backwards to be secret or whatever. And then the lead is soft enough that you can roll that piece of metal up like a scroll, sometimes put a nail through it, other times throw it down a well as if you're sending it down to Hades, which is not good, actually, if you're getting drinking water out of a well and people keep throwing their lead curse tablets down there. But anyway, so, but there's a real fear of curses used against you, and so there are also protection spells. It's really interesting because we have documents from Roman culture of prenuptial agreements where the wife has to promise not to use magic on the husband once they're married, right? So there's that. The other magical element, I guess, that I'll mention right now is amulets. Amulets are good luck charms. They are meant to be talismans of protection against curses from other people, against the evil eye. The evil eye is the eye of jealousy, and a lot of Romans believed that if someone was jealous of you, envious, if someone was resentful against you, the evil eye could actually cause bad things to happen to you, right? And so an amulet might have an eye on it that looks back at the evil eye, kind of like what's that card in the game Uno, where it's like, no, it's a reverse card back at you, right? So if somebody gives you the evil eye, the amulet throws it back on them. Could be a medallion worn around the neck with an inscription or something like that. But an amulet is basically a good luck charm meant to provide protection, right? So that's magic. So there's oracles, there's magic, and the third element of popular religion is astrology. Now, again, this is all about trying to have hope against fate. Now, you may be aware of this, but in the original mythology of Greece, the gods lived on the top of Mount Olympus. Eventually, somebody climbed Mount Olympus, got to the top, and noticed there were no gods living there. So the gods were said to have moved up into the heavens, which is why the planets are named after them, right? But the attributes of the god also get attributed or transferred to the planets. And so the planets then, they didn't really know about gravity per se, but the planets have this push-pull effect on people and on events in Earth, on cause and effect. And so that push-pull effect is supposed to have something to do with the, personality characteristics of the gods. Now, what you have to keep in mind here, of course, is that in the ancient world, there is no difference between astronomy and astrology. If anything, it starts out as kind of a farmer's almanac. Like astronomy is just trying to figure out the seasons of when to plant and when to harvest and all that. But when the philosophers come in, the philosophers start talking about something called the harmony of the spheres, which is that the planets seem to move like it's a music box, like there's a system of gears here. And the idea is that all the gears are connected. The planets are the big gears, right? But there are smaller and smaller gears all connected all the way down to the events of your daily life. And so if you can figure out the movements of the big gears, it'll help you with the small things. by observing the movements of the planets, it was believed that you could calculate the cause and effect of a person's life, right? So there's also no difference in the ancient world between astrology and mathematics, right? What we would call an astrologer, the Romans would call a mathematician, doing the math of the harmony of the spheres, the movement of the planets. The really interesting question, though, is whether a person believed that the stars and planets were thought to be simply telling you the way things are or what might happen. And this is what all of Eastern astrology was. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Chinese all believed, well, you can't do anything about it. Again, so there's that element of fate. But if you can watch the planets and the stars, you can see what's coming. And this is the Magi. The Magi can read the stars and say, let's go see that new king born in Israel. But for the Greeks and then the Romans, when you add the element of philosophy, knowing how to do the math on the stars and planets can actually give you some power over your own destiny. And that's the attraction for them. Again, just like with the oracles and with magic, they want to get out from under the determinism of fate, and they want some control over their life. Okay, so the first layer was household religion. The second layer was popular religion. Now the third layer this is where we get to the traditional Greco-Roman religion that you learned about in high school with all the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. This is what we might call the civic religion, right? The religion of patriotism in the Roman Empire. Now, Roman religion is really just Greek religion adapted for the Romans. At least it starts out that way. It all begins with the veneration of heroes, and then the addition of legends that they were conceived by gods who mated with humans, and then they become the heroes, and then after their death, they become deities. And you're going to see, or we have seen, that this is transferred to the emperors as well, right? And so, for the most part, the Roman deities are pretty much all the same as the Greek ones, but with Roman names. And I'm going to give you a chart that shows the comparison of, or the equivalencies of Greek and Roman deities. Now, it's not always a perfect one-to-one in every case. For example, Greek Aphrodite is Roman Venus, but some of the characteristics are different. So Aphrodite is the seductress, whereas Venus is the virgin, right? But the Romans were very motivated to say that their gods were the same gods as the Greek gods, but simply with the Roman versions of their names. And, it's part of the Roman myth that Rome is actually founded by someone who escaped from the city of Troy. And so there's a Greek lineage even behind Rome. At least that's the myth. Now, in the city of Rome, the most important temple was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, not Optimus Prime. I was just watching the Transformers with my grandson. Jupiter, the greatest and the best, Optimus Maximus. And actually that temple is a triple temple. It's a temple to what's called the Capitoline Triad. It's on the Capitoline Hill. The divine triad is the deities of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. And so Jupiter is the Roman version of Zeus. Juno is the Roman version of Hera, the wife of Zeus. And Minerva is the Roman version of Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Now, so these are the most important gods in the Roman pantheon, but as you know, there are many others. Now, the thing is that in Roman culture, you don't actually have to believe in these gods. And of course, the more time goes by and the more that philosophy comes in as a version of, it's going to be a layer of religion on its own. But the more philosophy comes in, the more people start to think, well, they don't really believe in these gods, or perhaps all of the gods are manifestations of of a single God. You're going to see that coming. But the point is that it doesn't matter whether you believe it. What matters is whether you participate in it. Because to fail to participate in the civic cult of these deities is to be seen as unpatriotic and antisocial. So the participation in this Greco-Roman religion is very much a show of patriotism, right? Again, remember, there's no separation of religion and government here. It's all one thing. State holidays are religious holidays, and they're state holidays because they're religious holidays. Government jobs are almost always also priesthoods of some cult. So if you get elected to be the director of public works in the city of Rome, you are automatically also the priest of the cult of Diana of the Drain, who is the goddess who watches over the sewers. I'm not making that up. That's a real thing, right? Every public meeting, including all of the entertainment, the circus, the theater, the arena, they all begin with and include pagan rituals. They are all a form of worship, which is why, in a Christian context, it becomes a dilemma whether Christians ought to go to the shows or not, right? So religion is always a government position, and government positions always have religious responsibilities. Originally, in the time of the kings, before Rome became an empire, the king himself would be considered the high priest of all of Rome's religion. And so then eventually that job, the high priest of Rome, came to be separated out from the king. And so you had the king, and then you had the king of sacred things, the Rex Sacrorum, the king of sacred things, right? This office, the king of sacred things, evolved into the office of the Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex Maximus is the highest priest. And now, interesting that Latin word pontifex is a compound word from pons and the word for to make something. And so the pontifex is the builder of bridges, right? Obviously implying bridges between the divine and the human, right? And so even in the empire, you have this office of the Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest of all the Roman cults. But eventually, guess what? The emperors take that title onto themselves, right? And then later in a Christian empire, the Pope gets that title, the highest priest, right? But you get the idea that they weren't separated. And you can see this actually in statues of the first emperor of the Roman Empire, the Emperor Augustus, Octavian. He had statues of himself made where he's wearing the dress of the Pontifex Maximus, of the high priest. And you can tell because he's got a hood over his head. That hood is there it's to prevent the high priest from seeing any bad omens. I guess if you don't see them, they don't count. But the idea is that when the high priest wants to read the omens, one thing he might do is flip back his hood and look up into the sky and gauge by the direction of the flights of birds, what's going to happen. And you don't want him to see it at the wrong time or the wrong birds or whatever. So they'd wear this hood, kind of covered their eyes from seeing into the sky at the wrong time. Well, you look at these statues of Augustus that he had made of himself. He's wearing the hood. Okay, so the point of all this is that Roman civic religion combines this idea of that worship of a deity is to engage in or enter into this service protection relationship, right? That's one thing. Combining that with expectations of patriotism and civic responsibilities, and also combined with entertainment. So even the the forms of entertainment that, were supposed to keep the people entertained. Well, these are also forms of propaganda for the empire and for the religion. Now, by the time of the empire, of course, there are many different priesthoods, and there are cults and temples for many different deities. And sometimes, like in a place like the city of Rome, would have almost every deity represented by multiple temples. And eventually, of course, you have the Pantheon, which is a temple dedicated to all the gods. Pantheon, all the gods. But even out in the colonies, in the provinces, you would have some of these cults exported. And so when the Romans wanted to reinforce the authority of the emperor in a province, they would they would build a temple to the emperor and set up statues, and they'd export the different cults that made sense at the time. And so the priesthoods of all of these cults and all of these temples, many of them are also political offices, right? And again, the priests of the Roman cults are not spiritual leaders. It's not a spiritual calling. It's a political appointment. Sometimes they're chosen at random by lots. Other times they're appointed by the emperor. But they're basically positions of honor, sometimes only honorary positions, but often, if you got elected to a particular government post, that meant that at least once a year you were on deck to preside over the rituals at, the worship for whatever deity was supposed to look after your thing, right? But most of these priesthoods did not have a distinctive dress or anything like that. They dressed like everybody else. The Pontifex Maximus would have been the exception to that, but most of them are just, again, as much or more government jobs than anything else. In addition to the traditional Greek deities who get Roman names, they also, both Greeks and Romans, also deified certain virtues and cosmic forces. So you have a god Pax or peace. You have a god Fortuna or fortune or TK in Greek. You have the goddess Victoria, which is obviously the goddess of victory. And by the way, in Greek, that's Nike or Nike, which is why the shoe company is named what it is. It means victory. It's the Greek goddess of victory. And all of these had their temples and their priesthoods, and as well as I mentioned earlier, the genius or the spirit of a city, like Roma. So Rome had a temple to the goddess Roma, right, etc. Athena is the protectress of Athens. And so these priesthoods all functioned as, in many ways, the same way you would expect to have, like in our culture, you might have a ceremony remembering veterans on Veterans Day. Well, again, that would be a religious cult, and someone would be in charge of that. There are also, among these priesthoods, there are also what are called augurs or soothsayers, right? And these are a little bit like the oracles, but they function more like priests of the pagan cults. But these are the guys who are said to be able to determine the will of the gods. And so they might look at the flight patterns of birds. They might sacrifice an animal and spill out its entrails. They might throw some bones on an altar, almost like throwing dice. And in that way, they would supposedly discern the will of the gods. And it was actually these guys who created the calendar. And of course, the 12-month calendar that we now have went through some revisions. And so some of the months are named after just the number of the month that it used to be. But notice, September, sept is 7. Why is that the ninth month? October, oct is 8. Why is that the 10th month? Well, it's because, we also have months named after Augustus, August, and Julius Caesar, July, right, that were inserted in there. So the calendar's a mess. But it was these guys, the augurs or the soothsayers, that sort of started the whole calendar thing. Again, partly as like a farmer's almanac for agriculture, partly for astrology, but also to mark the festivals, the religious festivals of ancient Rome, the holidays, right? I want to say one more thing about traditional, the civic religion, the traditional Greco-Roman cults. The fate of the dead. What happens when a person dies? Now, if you're taking my classes, you may read my book, What Really Happens After We Die. That's going to give you the traditional Christian understanding of that comes from the church fathers, the early church, and a little bit from the Middle Ages. But what about the Greco-Roman understanding of the afterworld? Well, in Greco-Roman culture, the dead go to the underworld. It is a continuation of this life, but more like in a dream state. It's a shadowy, mirror-y kind of existence of this life, that life goes on, but in this almost less real kind of existence. And so most of the, most people would be assumed would go to Hades. Now, in English culture, we're used to the idea of Hades being the equivalent of hell, but it's really not. Hades is kind of a neutral place. It's where most of the dead people go. It's across the river Styx, if you remember the mythology, right? But most people go to Hades, and it's sort of morally neutral, right? The best people, the heroes, and again, when I say morally, I don't mean in terms of holiness, but the heroes, the victorious warriors, those people who had exceptional honor in life would go to their version of paradise, which is called Elysium, or the Elysian Fields. If you saw Gladiator, you see that he goes to Elysium. It's like a sort of agricultural paradise, although there's plenty that's not historically accurate with regard to Roman religion in that movie, but you get the idea. Now, the really bad people, they went to a place called Tartarus. Tartarus is really more the equivalent of what we normally think of as hell, and again, it's for the Stalins and Hitlers of ancient Greece and Rome. It's for the really bad people. Only the really bad people go to Tartarus, and again, what might make the difference is whether you brought honor to your family, to your ancestors. It's not about personal holiness. It's not about what you did behind closed doors. It's not about how you treated other people, but it's about personal glory, right? And did you, like somebody like the Emperor Nero, after his death, he would be considered someone who was so dishonorable that he probably went to Tartarus. But most people just go to regular old Hades. What you don't want to happen to you, and this is the thing that scared people most, is not that they might go to Tartarus. What scared people most is that they might not get a proper burial, and then they would wander the earth in unrest as a ghost. Now, the Romans tended to cremate. So when I say proper burial, that could include cremation, but it has to be a cremation and then interment in a tomb or a mausoleum or something like that. Someone who doesn't get a proper burial, again, and that could be the result of a life of dishonor. If you dishonor yourself, you don't get a proper burial. It could be extreme poverty. which is why they had those funeral clubs that people would form a club so that in case any die, the rest of the club members would make sure they got a proper burial, right? And so the worst thing that could happen to you in terms of the afterlife, in most people's minds, was that you might end up as a ghost and you're not resting in peace, right? For those who did get the proper burial and who were resting in peace, they were still somehow connected to the place where they're buried. And so, again, Hades is this shadowy existence. It is a continuation of this life. They do need provisions. And so the loved ones would visit the tomb and bring food. And they actually had little holes in the tomb to drop in bits of food, to pour wine down. It had what was called a libation hole, a hole to pour wine into the tomb. And this tradition of visiting the tomb of the loved one who's passed away at least once a year on the anniversary of their death, that is called the refrigerium. It means something like the refreshment, and it actually is where we get our English word refrigerator. But the refrigerium is a way of bringing provisions to the deceased loved one. Now, the early Christians did continue the tradition of the refrigerium, but not because they thought their loved ones needed food or wine poured down a libation hole. They did not. The early Christians continued the tradition for very different reasons, which we talk about in our classes. And so this is not the same kind of way where a Christian might visit the tomb of a loved one. It's not this. It's nothing like the Christian doctrine of the resurrection, where the soul and body, sort of remain united in a way that the remains of the body, the relics or remains, await the resurrection. It's not the same as that. It's also not the same as the Christian understanding of reward and punishment in the afterlife, right? So, Christians taught that, and still teach that, it's possible that you might not be saved and you will end up in hell. But for those who are going on to salvation, we hope to end up in paradise, and then in the resurrection, perhaps passing through purgatory. But the point is that that's a very different thing than what the Greeks and the Romans believed. And so it can be a little tricky and a little confusing. So for example, if you're reading your Old Testament and you see the word Hades in there in the Psalms or something, that's not necessarily the same thing as what we think of as hell. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that is what I'm going to say about traditional Greco-Roman religion. The fourth layer of religious options here in the Roman world is what I'm going to call membership religions, right? Now, think back to what I was just talking about. The civic cults, the traditional old Greco-Roman deities and all that, that doesn't work on initiation and membership. Everybody's expected to participate. So you don't have to get initiated into that. You're just in it by not even just being a citizen, but by being a resident, by living in the empire. You're expected to participate in that. The membership religions, though, are different in the sense that you choose to belong to one or another of them. You wouldn't necessarily join multiple ones, but you can certainly belong to one while you're still also participating in the traditional civic cult. Sometimes these membership religions are called mystery cults. Sometimes they're referred to as Eastern cults. But, I mean, in a lot of ways, all of this is from the East. So to call these Eastern mystery religions is maybe a little bit, not so accurate. So you can call them mystery cults because because the idea is you're being initiated into kind of a secret society, right? So the mystery cults were much more personal in nature. They're not private in the sense of like based on, personal internal convictions and beliefs per se. But they're also not civic in the sense that, you perform the rituals out in front of everybody on feast days that everybody celebrates. These are more private, but still social, right? And of course, as I said, the biggest difference between the civic religion and these membership religions is that they make you go through an individual initiation to join. So they're very much like fraternities or sororities or like Masonic lodges. Now, since the initiations were all secret, we don't really know for sure what they entailed. We do know that in various versions of these membership cults, there was ceremonial drug use, there was the drinking of intoxicating beverages, there was often wild, frenzied dancing, and sometimes orgies. So again, like fraternities, right? I can say that I was in a fraternity. So we do know though that again, the membership is based on initiation. So to participate in the cult, you had to be initiated. But again, even here, it's not really about your personal faith. If you went through a ritual to be initiated, all that mattered is that you went through it, not that you believed or believed correctly. None of that mattered. I think, one could make the argument that the difference between these membership religions and Christianity, because, let's face it, in a way, Christianity is also a membership religion. You got to get baptized to join. But the difference between Christianity and these other membership religions is kind of like the difference between a sacrament and a magic spell, right? For us, the initiation, baptism is a sacrament. For these rituals, it's like you're going through a magic incantation, and just all that mattered was that you went through the ritual, and that said something about you, not only to those inside the cult, but to those outside as well. Also, the initiations were expensive, right? Which demonstrated a commitment and theoretically an ongoing commitment to supporting the cult financially. But after all, if you're going to go through, especially if you're going to go through an initiation that included an animal sacrifice, somebody's got to buy the animal. You have to pay for the animal. If you're watching the Rome series, the HBO Rome series, which again, I will always make the disclaimer, a lot of nudity, a lot of sex, a lot of violence. So I'm not saying I recommend it per se, especially don't watch it with the kids, but it is actually way more historically accurate than something like Gladiator. But anyway, so for what it's worth, if you're watching that series and you notice the character who gets the baptism in bull's blood, right? That's an example of this kind of initiation. All right. So the initiation brings the believer into a new relationship with the deity, supposedly, and in return, the believer is supposedly promised special blessings. And so, in other words, think again back to the patron-client relationship. The initiation makes the devotee of the cult a client of the deity, and the deity becomes that person's patron, right? And now, but for the mystery cults, right, this relationship now is going to mean something new that we haven't really seen yet in the Greco-Roman religion. I just finished telling you about in the traditional Greco-Roman religion, their view of the afterlife was that most people go to Hades and you just got to make sure you get a proper burial. That's what's most important. But now with these membership cults, and by the way, here Christianity is like this, but now with these membership cults, there's a different view of the afterlife. Whereas, where what the cult promises the initiate is a more blessed afterlife than someone who's not in the cult, right? So we're starting to see this element of, it's not morality per se, right? Because it's not like, love your neighbor and all that. It's just join the club. And if you're in the club, the deity promises you a more blessed afterlife than if you were not in the club, right? But there doesn't seem to be really an ongoing relationship with the other members outside of the ritual worship times. And so you have this vertical relationship with the deity where you become a client of the deity becomes your patron, but you don't really have the horizontal relationship with other people. I don't see an obligation to support the other people other than just, supporting the cult itself. You don't get the sort of love your neighbor that you get within Christianity. Now, with these membership cults, though, this is also another thing that's different from the Roman civil religion, because here now the priests are not just politicians. Here the priests are actually kind of set apart from the rest of the culture. They would wear some distinctive dress. They might shave their heads. Some of them were voluntarily, theoretically, castrated. And so in one way or another, the priesthoods separated themselves from the rest of society. And they were, of course, organized into a hierarchy that was completely separate from the government. Now, there are actually a lot of different these membership religions or mystery cults. And depending on where you go in the empire, there's many that are very localized and specific to one place or one ethnic group. But there are a few that became almost universal in the Roman world. Okay, so I just want to make one more point about the membership religions or mystery cults. If you've heard of some of them, and especially the cult of Mithras, and you will sometimes see how they have elements that look like Christianity. So, for example, the Mithras cult actually had a ritual meal that kind of looks like the Eucharist. And as it turns out, these are elements of Christianity that got co-opted or borrowed from Christianity and added to these mystery cults later. So these are not backgrounds to Christianity. They're actually plagiarizing Christianity in some of these ways. So when you see a lot of these, well, there aren't a lot, but when you see a few parallels between Christianity, some of these other cults like Mithras, that's what's going on there. Those elements that look like Christianity are later than Christianity. Okay, well, layer number 5 is philosophy as religion. And as time goes on, more and more the educated and the higher socioeconomic levels of society lean into philosophy as their true belief, as opposed to, the traditional Greco-Roman deities. And of course, they'll still continue as good citizens participating in the rituals of the civic cult. But as far as what they actually believe, it starts out with, the gods must have moved away from Mount Olympus and gone up into the heavens, and it shifts from that even more and more into philosophy. Now, I'm not going to talk about philosophy very much here. That would require a course all on its own, and here's what I'll say. All of the philosophical schools of Greece and Rome were an attempt to answer the question, how do I live the good life? Now, obviously, first you have to define good. But the point is that that's the core question that every philosophical school is attempting to answer. How do I not waste my life? How do I live the good life? And they all have their approach. And even the philosopher known as Jesus had his approach. And I would argue, and I have argued, that the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus's philosophical dialogue. that the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' answer to the question, how do I live the good life? He's literally answering the same question that all of the other philosophers attempted to answer. So when I wrote A Week in the Life of Rome, and by the way, this is the book in case you're not familiar with it. When I wrote A Week in the Life of Rome, I wrote this into it, and this is Peter speaking. So I put this in the mouth of Peter. The philosophers, in fact, can't even agree on what it means to be blessed. The Pythagoreans say reason is the key to the good life. The sophists claim individualism and relativism. Socrates said it was law, and Plato said it was justice. The skeptics say the best thing you can do is admit you don't know. The cynics prefer detachment, and the Epicureans pursue pleasure. The Stoics claim to have defined virtue, but look around you. Are the Romans virtuous? Are they happy? No. Yeshua said that the ones who are blessed are the poor, and those who mourn, and the humble, and the hungry, those who show mercy, and those who make peace, the pure, and the persecuted. Marcus muttered to himself, I should be writing this down. And that's just a little joke there in case you didn't get it. The Gospel of Mark does not have the Sermon on the Mount in it, so Mark says I should be writing this down. I should say, though, that of all the philosophical schools, it was Stoicism that had the most influence on Roman culture and in some ways even on Christianity, and especially, I would say, on monastic expressions of Christianity. But always remember, like we talked about in History 1 in our intro class, always remember the Christians were selective about what they took from Greco-Roman philosophy and what they left behind. And what they took from Greco-Roman philosophy was always consistent with and never contradicted what was revealed to them in the scriptures from Judaism, right? So all of the elements of even Stoicism that came to be used to help describe developing Christianity, it can all be found in the Old Testament. So that's nothing new. All right. Finally, the sixth layer of Roman religion is the imperial cult, the cult of the emperors, worship of the emperors. Now, I deal with this enough, I think, in History 1, in the intro course, but I want to say a few things about it. I want to go beyond what I said there a little bit. To understand the imperial cult, you need to understand the Roman concept of spirits, right? And I talked a little bit about this when I mentioned the genius of a person or a place is the spirit of that person or place, and even of an inanimate object like a mountain or a forest. Spirits in Greco-Roman thought are a lot like how we think of angels. They're the messengers of the gods. And especially in the way we might think of the concept of a guardian angel, like mediators between the human and the divine, who perhaps guide the human. Now, what you have to remember, though, is that in Judeo-Christian thought, there are no degrees of divinity, right? I mean, you're either divine or you're not. You can't be a little bit divine. You can't be a little more divine than people, but less divine than the Father. I mean, that was Arius's mistake, right? There can't be degrees of divinity. But in Greco-Roman thought, there are degrees of divinity, just like there are degrees of materiality. You and I are more tangible. A spirit is still material, but less tangible, thinner, more wispier. So there are these degrees of materiality. There are degrees of divinity. So in the Greco-Roman mind, a spirit is divine, but less divine than the gods. And so, you see in Greco-Roman thought this hierarchy of deities, right? There are gods, there are the lesser deities, or the spiritual beings. Then there are the souls of the dead that might be seen as more divine than the living, right? And then there's the spirit of a person or the spirit in a person. Now in Greek, all of these spirits are originally called daimons, demons. right? But that doesn't have the negative connotation that it has in Christian thought. There are good demons and there are bad demons. In Roman culture, they're called the genius. The genius of a person or the genius of a place is the spirit animating that person or place. So a person's genius in Roman thought is kind of like a blurred line between your soul and your guardian angel, right? And that spirit could protect you, could control you, could advise you, could guide you, right? And again, there could be the spirits of a house or the guardians of that house, or at least you hope they will be. That's why you leave offerings. And then there's the spirit of a city, for example, Roma is the deified genius or spirit of the city of Rome. Athena is originally the deified spirit of the city of Athens. Some people started saying that every person has two spirits, a good one and a bad one. Think of the old cartoons with the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. But eventually, especially with the influence of philosophy, people started saying, well, if there is one high God over all the other gods, at the very least, that high God must be good. And evil can't really be a creation of the high God. So how do you account for bad fortune, bad luck, tragedy? How do you account for that? Well, that all gets blamed on the bad spirits, which now that word demon starts to come in as the thing that that describes the bad spirits, right? And so even the pagans and the Jews had their version of exorcisms to get rid of the bad spirits. And I may have mentioned when we were talking about the household deities, some of the household deities, the hope is that they would keep the bad spirits away. And your hope as an individual is that your genius, your good spirit will protect you from the bad spirits, right? And again, not too far from what Christians believe about angels. And so there may be some influence from Judaism on paganism here. But the point of all that is this. What we call emperor worship was really the worship of the emperor's genius or spirit, right? And the hope was that if everyone worshiped the emperor's genius, that would make the emperor a better emperor and things would go better for the empire. Now, I've already talked about, in other contexts, the escalation of divine titles, where, throughout the first century, the Roman emperors demand to be called more and more by these obviously divine titles until you hit a peak with Domitian at the end of the first century, where he demands to be called Lord and God. And of course, remember, Domitian is the guy referred to in the book of Revelation with the number 666, right? So that's Domitian, and he's claiming these divine titles, right? But under the surface of that, there's also an evolution in the meaning behind the titles, right? That goes from at one point worshiping the emperor's genius as the spirit whom you hope will guide and help the emperor, to worshiping the emperor himself as the god. Now, by the end of the first century, the emperor is the god, right? And we see that as the first century goes on, emperors more and more get temples and cults and priesthoods dedicated to them. And so, the line is blurred between the emperor's genius as the one who gets worshipped and the emperor himself. Now, there's no dogma or theology of emperor worship that gets articulated in the Roman context. It's just all about loyalty, and it's all about this sort of escalating attempt to demonstrate loyalty so that, eventually, before the Great Persecution, you see sacrifices to the emperor or to the gods that he designates as his patrons, as a test of loyalty and patriotism. and the failure to participate in those sacrifices is considered an act of treason, punishable by death. And so that's part of the escalation of the persecution. But remember that in the patron-client system, the emperor is everyone's patron. And Augustus was given the title Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. And when an emperor is victorious over his enemies, especially any enemy that might invade the Roman borders, the emperor is given the title Savior of the people, the one who restores the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. So basically, the emperor, rides the coattails of the traditional religion until he's at the top of it in a certain way, and this is actually kind of emulating Egyptian religion, where again with that idea of degrees of divinity, that you have the gods, but then the emperor, or in Egypt's case the pharaoh, is just that one notch lower than the gods on that same scale of degrees of divinity. So the end result of that is that, whether you're talking about the pharaoh in Egypt or the emperor in Rome, the difference between a living emperor and the gods is a difference in degree, not in kind. They're just a little bit lower than the gods. And I kind of hinted at this earlier too, but a lot of the mystery cults or the membership religions were geography specific, and they did migrate to Rome. Conquered slaves would bring them to Rome. Soldiers coming back from battle would bring them into Rome. Travelers, merchants, right? These religions from elsewhere migrate to Rome, but at the same time, the imperial cult gets exported out to the colonies as a part of the empire's colonialism and as a way to extend the authority of the emperor out to the colonies. And sometimes in the provinces, you even get the wives or the mothers of the emperors get their cults and their temples. And they might get titles like Mater Patriae, mother of the fatherland, right? And so the emperor is seen as this quasi-divine savior figure, and his wife or his mother might be referred to as the mother even by the legions. And so we see these kinds of things, and we see these kinds of things coming out on the coins, right? And even if the emperors themselves did not design the coins, the people who did wanted to flatter the emperors, and so they put this stuff on the coins. Okay, so those are the 6 layers of religion or religious options in the Roman world. Now, before I finish up, I want to say a word about monotheism and where that comes in. Obviously, you know that Judaism is a monotheistic religion. Now, there's some debate about whether the earliest expressions of Hebrew religion believed there was only one God, or that there might be other gods, but they should worship only one God. Not exactly relevant for our purposes, because by the time the later Hebrew religion and then Christianity, obviously the assumption is that not only are they only supposed to worship one God, but there is only one God. There are no other gods that exist. So we know where the monotheism for Christianity comes from, but we also see it coming into the Roman world from other places. So, for example, we see it in philosophy, and we see it in Egyptian sun worship that gets imported to Rome. We see this trend toward monotheism, and it kind of starts with the consolidation of multiple gods into fewer and fewer gods, or the idea that there is one high God who has authority over all the other gods, or the idea that the lesser deities are expressions of the one high God. So it begins with this idea that if you're Roman, we have to show how our deities are just the same as the Greek deities, but with a Roman version of their name or whatever. But then they become more and more consolidated. but it's still not an exclusive religion, right? I mean, you can believe in as many gods as you want. So the motivation for that is not so much to reduce the number of gods as just to simplify things, I guess. And, Tertullian, again, had made the point, and I think Christians were making the point that, you guys have so many gods. How do you know you're not angering the ones you're not worshiping by only worshiping some of them? And so I think there was even some pressure there to consolidate. But at any rate, people talking about maybe some of these lesser deities are really just, geniuses or spirits or demons, and others are subordinate to the more important ones. And at the same time, we also see arguments for intelligent design. We can see it in some of the early Christian apologetics too. This idea that the universe, creation, is so intricate and so perfect in the sense of how it all works together and everything, that there must have been an intelligent creator who created it all. And so, like, for example, the early Christian apologists will say something like this, if you see a ship and, it's headed for the rocks and crashes on the rocks, you could argue that there's no pilot, that it's an abandoned ship. But if you see a ship and it sails perfectly into harbor and anchors, right where it's supposed to, you can't argue there's no pilot. You know there is a captain. There's a pilot in that ship. So the ship coming successfully into harbor is proof that there is a pilot on that ship. And in the same way, the fact that the universe works is evidence that there is an intelligent creator God. And this fits right in with that idea of, the harmony of the spheres. This, what the philosophers called universal sympathy. Universal sympathy. It is kind of a symphony. But the idea that, all the gears work together, right, in the universe. And so if you were willing to say that the gods had moved from Mount Olympus into the heavens, that they're now the planets, or that, their spirits guide the movements of the planets, or whatever it is. Well, what's the biggest planet? We know it's not a planet, but to them, the biggest one is the sun. And so if there's one high god over all the other gods, well, that it must be represented by the biggest planet, the sun, right, and the brightest. And so, we see this sun worship, and probably comes originally from Egypt. But there were a couple of Roman emperors who tried to make sun worship a priority for them. One tried to make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, this idea that Christianity does get made the official religion of the Roman Empire, that's not the first attempt at having one single, in fact, monotheistic religion as the official religion of the Roman Empire. There was this emperor, Elagabalus, in the 3rd century. He was emperor from 218 to 222, and he had lived in Egypt. He had been a priest of the sun god called Elagabal there, and so he took the name of the sun god. And then when he became emperor, he tried to make that the official Roman religion. And it caught on a little bit in the upper classes because, again, through philosophy, people are starting to be ready for the idea of a single God. But it never caught on with the common people. And, he was only emperor for a few years. So it never really caught on as a specific religion, the religion of Sol, S-O-L, the sun. But it does kind of get bound up with the imperial cult. And so that even when we have our first Christian emperor, Constantine, there was some confusion of what he was trying to do with Christianity and this Egyptian Sol religion or sun religion. And he doesn't seem to have corrected it. Like he could have, but he let it go. He allowed this confusion because it allowed him to bring Christianity in, I think, more smoothly. But you get the idea that there are pre-Christian versions of monotheism that are starting to come in from really three different angles into the Roman Empire. One, of course, was Judaism. Then there's philosophy, and then there's Egyptian sun worship. And so we start to see these things, and then there are other elements of pre-Christian religion that you could say are parallels to Christianity. Some of them are borrowed directly from Christianity. So, like, for example, Mithraism borrows directly from Christianity. So you can't argue that Mithraism is a background for Christianity. But there are other elements of, certain aspects of Greco-Roman religion, like, the idea that someone could be the son of a god. Although, in Christianity, Jesus is both divine and human, both fully divine and fully human, not half and half, right? But other ideas like this creep in, and, it's important to remember what Clement of Alexandria said. He said, philosophy is the schoolmaster to the Greek mind to prepare it for Christ, just the way Judaism in the Old Testament was the schoolmaster for the Hebrew mind to prepare it for Christ. And so just like the Jews have the Old Testament to pave the way for to be ready to receive the incarnation, so the Greco-Roman mind had all of these elements that come together. And we could do a whole lecture on that, but this has gone on long enough. So that kind of gives you an overview of the religious context in which Christianity finds itself. And obviously, the fact that Christianity, like Judaism, was an exclusive religion, you don't get to worship multiple gods. You have to pick one, right? And that set it apart from the Greco-Roman religions, but also it made the Christians look antisocial and unpatriotic. The Jews, for a long time, got a pass because it was seen by the Romans as their religion is ancient, and so something that's ancient is automatically respectable. But when the Romans started to understand Christianity as something separate from Judaism, if it could, as long as it flew under the radar as a sect within Judaism, it got a pass because it was ancient like Judaism. But once the Romans saw it as something separate from Judaism, it wasn't ancient anymore. Now it was new, and now it was dangerous, and that led to the escalation of persecution. All right, thanks for joining me on this longer lecture, but I hope that gives you the big picture. And those of you in the class, we can debrief at our next discussion group.